Political polarization impacts our society in many ways. Among them, there's a divide within the American population about protecting important classically liberal values, including free speech rights. That was the subject of a recent speech for the John Locke Foundation's Shaftesbury Society. The speaker, our next guest, Dr. Thomas Cushman, is a visiting senior research fellow at Wake Forest University, also a professor at Wellesley College. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So political polarization, we know, is causing major changes in the United States, and you say it's also affecting how people view free speech rights. How so?
Well, it's I'll talk about it today in my talk later on, but the polarization has to do with competition over competing values. So if you ask young people, for instance, in college surveys about which values they would like to see more protection of, there's a fairly strong divide that breaks down around gender, political party, race. And in a recent survey done of college students, a very good survey, a Knight Gallup poll, I believe it is, you can see the divides among the young people especially. So that, for instance, if you ask students the question, which do you prefer to have more protection, inclusion and diversity or freedom of expression? And there are very strong divides on that by significant percentage points. So, for instance, Democrats, women, African Americans, and those three particular groups tend to favor diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are three important values in American history. But if you look at white men who are Republicans, it's completely the opposite. So you can see it on college campuses, at least which is where I work, that there's a very strong divide. It's not like they don't care about the other values, it's just they prefer protection of one value set over another. And I do believe that's also very apparent in the survey data for the general American population. As a sociologist, I pay fairly careful attention to that. Same breakdown: women who are Democrats, liberal Democrats, white women who are liberal Democrats, African American who are Americans who are Democrats, tend to favor diversity, equity, and inclusion, whereas white male Republicans, conservatives tend to favor the defense of free speech rights. And the percentage differences are quite stark, actually.
And this, I suspect, is a change. If we looked back some years ago, you would see more general support for free speech rights.
Well, exactly. And I'm starting to get up there in years, and I see generational differences. And I never thought, for instance, as a college professor, I would have to explain why freedom of expression was important to young people. I just assumed they all learned that somewhere. But evidently, they're not really learning that somewhere, because many of them come in with very little knowledge, very little understanding of the scope of the First Amendment or the jurisprudence about the First Amendment in the last several hundred years. And so you can't assume students coming into even the most elite colleges have a strong appreciation that was just assumed by people of my generation. We just didn't question it. And we were taught that. And I think now in the high schools, the students just simply, they're getting more, I think, of the diversity, equity, and inclusion value system, which means you shouldn't say things that, quote unquote, harm people or make them feel offended or uncomfortable. And that's more enforced, say, in a high school setting, which is a much more disciplinarian setting. And so when they get to college, they just keep adhering to the same value systems. And it's a hard work to convince them that freedom of expression helps everybody, especially if you want diversity, equity, and inclusion. The only way to get that is by saying why you're not included, why you're not being treated equally. And I think that's the argument I try to make.
That is the voice of Dr. Thomas Cushman, visiting senior research fellow at Wake Forest University, also professor at Wellesley College. You alluded to this, but I want to loop back to it.
Sure thing.
If a substantial portion of our young people or the American population at large values freedom of expression less than some of these other values, what sorts of problems does that create for our society?
Well, I mean, one claim that I make, the first claim that I ever make when I talk about the right of freedom of expression, is that it's a reason that is in the First Amendment. Because my view is, at least, that the founders understood that freedom of expression, being able to make rights claims or to complain about the violation of your rights, necessitated freedom of expression. It's the right from which all other rights evolve or are articulated. And you can't make any other rights claims, whether it's about equality or progressive values or any kinds of claims, without having that right of freedom of expression. But what you tend to see is people essentially not understanding the connection between the fundamental, we would say in law, non-derogable right of freedom of expression and its connection to any kind of rights claim of injustice or violation of civil rights or anything like that. So it has to be the starting point for all other rights claims. And I think with some persuasion, you can persuade people of that. How could Martin Luther King have ever fostered the civil rights movement without freedom of speech? And I had a very interesting African-American young man tell me when I said that. He said, well, he shouldn't have had to die for it. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good response, that you shouldn't have to die for expressing your right of freedom of speech. But this is what, what struck me, is that it is dangerous to speak freely, especially in a climate where there is hatred, there is violence, and that kind of thing.
So we have this divide. We see this from the survey results.
Yes.
What do we do about it?
Everybody asks me that, but I think some of these things are generational. That I'm already seeing in some of the younger generations who come in, say to the college, who are 4 years younger than maybe the students who have really pushed these. These values seem to be prominent among the millennial generation, and we sociologists have waves of generations. I'm never going to say time will tell, but I do know that there are generational shifts in beliefs and value systems. So, for instance, when anybody asks me that question, I generally tell them that if you went back in time to Berkeley in the 1960s, that that's where the site of student radicalism was, including in my own field, sociology. They took over buildings and created havoc, and they wanted to create a revolution. And I had a professor that was teaching there at the time, and he said, well, what comes after the revolution? They said, well, we don't know. We just want to have the revolution. It's never a good idea to have a revolution and not kind of know where you're going, because then you don't end very well. But the reason I bring up this story is that if you look at the data later on, in 1980, if my memory serves me right, over 50% of the students at Berkeley voted for Ronald Reagan. So I don't think it's a one-way trajectory. I don't think freedom of speech is on the way out. If you ask the whole population, it's about 50-50. When you break down these ethnic differences and racial differences and gender differences, it becomes more pronounced. But I do think there's something like a pendulum, that there's a swing back and forth, and that we might be in a diversity, equity, and inclusion pendulum right now side. And I think that it's my hope, anyway, that maybe people might see that it's really not a very pleasant state to exist in a situation where you're constantly afraid to say what you think. And some recent poll data show that about 80% of Americans across the board are afraid to say what they think. They're afraid of political correctness.